What is God? This is an advanced explanation and FAQ. This is going to be a two-part mini-series. In part one, we're going to cover the fundamentals. We're going to give you a full explanation of God. And in part two, we're going to address commonly asked questions and objections. So this here will be a complete explanation of God based on my own direct experiences, not dogmas that I believe or a particular ideology that I like and that I defend, but stuff that I have become directly conscious of myself. Needless to say, nothing that I say here should be taken on faith or blindly believed by you. You should use your critical thinking, and you should follow it up and try to verify the things that I talk about in your own direct experiences. The things I'll be talking about can be verified by you. That's my claim, at least, and it's your job to actually do it. And I'm inviting you to do it. The whole point of this conversation is so that you can see the potential of doing it and then get inspired and motivated to actually do it. Of course, you're going to have a lot of objections to the things that I say here and lots of questions. All of these objections will be addressed. I'll try to address as many as I can as we go here in part one, but there's just too many of them to address them all, which is why we're going to have a part two specifically focusing on those. So if you really want a comprehensive understanding with all of your doubts allayed, then make sure you stick around for part two. Now, this question of God. What is God? You have to appreciate the depth of this question. This is a very advanced topic, and it's a quite challenging communication that we're about to have here. How do I communicate something to you that is beyond words? Your mind doesn't want to hear what I have to say on this topic. Your mind wants to misinterpret what I have to say on this topic. This is probably the most controversial and confusing topic that the human mind can tackle. Of all time, of all the topics, you think calculus is challenging? You think quantum mechanics is challenging? No. Understanding what God is, that's the real challenge, because it's full of so much trickery and deception. This topic is fraught with dogma, self-deception, and closed-mindedness. It's deeply counterintuitive and paradoxical, and it threatens your entire way of life. So the mind finds ways to misunderstand what God is very easily. And we're going to have to address some of those before we can really tell you what God is. I can tell you right now, but first we have to lay a little bit of introduction, because it's pointless to tell you when you're not going to understand, when you're going to fall into various ways of misinterpreting what's being said. You have to appreciate this question of what is God? What we're really asking about here is we're asking about the source and origin of all of existence, all of creation. We're trying to go beyond the Big Bang, beyond where science can typically go. And so you should expect that's not going to happen easily. You're not just going to be able to go on Google and type in what is God and then get a 5-minute video that explains to you what it is. I mean, you can find that, but you're not going to really understand, which is why we're spending quite a bit of time introducing this and setting it up properly. I want you to appreciate that people who delivered these teachings as little as a couple hundred years ago were burned at the stake. And even today, in the 21st century, in certain parts of the world, if I was to go and deliver this teaching seriously, I would be stoned to death or beheaded or kicked out of the country. See, so this is serious stuff we're talking about. We're talking about life and death issues here. This isn't just some entertainment or some philosophy. Now, of course, mankind has been teaching about God for thousands of years since the beginning of time, but also for all of that time, many of these teachers have been murdered, killed, suppressed, persecuted, especially when they're teaching it in a way that doesn't fit with the orthodoxy of their culture. And especially in the way that I'll be teaching it here, because I'm not beholden to any orthodoxies or try to satisfy any cultural norms. So just Keep all that in mind. Of course, the elephant in the room, the first question we have to answer before we even get to what God is does God even exist? What are we saying that exists when we talk about God? The answer is yes, God does exist. This is not a personal opinion of mine. This is not a dogma that I hold. This is something that you can verify for yourself. It's a fact. But of course, the question is, what does that really mean to say that God exists? Certainly, I'm not meaning that there is a bearded man in the clouds sitting down, looking upon you and judging you and throwing you into hell. That's not what we mean. That's a metaphor. So what do we really mean when we say God exists? You see, a lot of people, they get so heated about God and they have a very strong opinion about, yes, God exists or no, God doesn't exist, that they don't really even bother to question what are they saying yes or no to. What is this thing you're affirming or denying? So while God does exist, God is not what you think it is what I'm saying. And I'll tell you what it is in a minute here, but we got to build up a little bit more. There are three types of worldviews or people that we need to contend with here in this explanation. Firstly is the fundamentalist theists, the religious people, the evangelicals, the Christians, the Catholics, the Jews, the Muslims, and even certain fundamentalist Buddhists and so forth. These people, we're calling them the theists, who of course deeply believe in God, and they live a godly life, or so they think. Then we have the second type of person, which is sort of the opposite. We have the atheists, the materialists, the rationalists, and the scientifically minded people, the pragmatically minded people. These are the people that don't believe in God because they trust their eyes and their senses. And hey, Leo, where's God? There's no God, so why are we even talking about it? Those types of people. These are the people who believe that God is a creation of mankind, created by mankind to brainwash others. And the third type of person is the agnostic, which is an interesting case because you would think, well, maybe the agnostics have it right because they're somewhere in the middle. Well, the agnostic believes that oftentimes what they believe is that it's not possible to know. Who are we to really know? We have to be humble and we have to just kind of stay out of it. And we have to be open to both possibilities. Maybe the theists are right. Maybe the atheists are right. Who really knows? Well, all three of these worldviews are confused, deeply, deeply confused, and misunderstand what God is. They're confused and mistaken in their own unique ways. But each of them also has a little kernel of truth, a tiny kernel of truth, that is being missed amongst all the confusion and error. And so what we really want to do is we want to separate those two apart, sort the wheat from the chaff. We want to save that kernel of truth, collect all the kernels of truth from all three of these, and then discard all of the confusion and the delusion. Now, if you know about my history, I was an atheist for the majority of my life. So I'm not coming at you from some religious tradition. I wasn't a fundamentalist Christian or evangelical or anything like this. I was an atheist for a good 25 years of my life. And then just as little as 3 or 4 years ago, I had my first direct consciousness of God. And then, of course, my views quickly changed, and I became very aware of all the traps and limitations of atheism. And also, I've done a lot of study into theism, into agnosticism, so I'm very familiar now. Now, having experienced God, I'm very familiar with all the confusion that goes on here. So I can help you to clarify this. Now, to understand the problem, especially if you're atheistically minded, you have to understand the Pre Trans Fallacy. And this is a concept popularized by Ken Wilber. The Pre Trans Fallacy helps us to make sense of this whole sticky wicket. And the way that it basically works is we have 3 categories of worldview. And these are stages of cognitive development that the human psyche evolves through individually and collectively. It's the pre-rational, the rational, and the trans-rational. Now, the pre-rational, these are your classic stereotypical fundamentalist religious zealot types. These are your Jerry Falwells of the world, who have a strong faith, Bible-thumping Christians and fundamentalist Muslims and even Buddhists and so forth. A good chunk of the world is pre-rational. They're not interested in scientifically validating God. They just believe that God is what they believe it is. And it's not even a doubt in their mind about that. And they try to live an upstanding moral life, and they follow the scriptures, their Bible, and so forth. That's the pre-rational. And they're prone to superstitious and various kinds of mythical thinking. These people could buy into Armageddon and various kinds of stories that they take literally, like Noah's Ark and so forth. Of course, many people in the developed world are too evolved for that. They've moved on to the next level, which is the rational stage. At the rational stage, you shed some of those superstitions and dogmas, and you start to question, you start to doubt, you become more skeptical, you start to become more empirical, you start to appreciate the value of science and thinking through things rationally for yourself, proof, consensus building, and this sorts of stuff that is done by the modern scientific community. And so you buy into that. And so really science becomes your sort of new religion. So the fallacy comes in that the people who are at the rational stage, they think of themselves as being so far above and more evolved than the pre-rational stage that they ignore that there is a trans-rational third stage of development. What is the trans-rational? Well, it's a little difficult to describe because it's beyond language and beyond the mind. The trans-rational is not a rejection of rationality, it's a going beyond rationality and realizing the limits of rationality. And really, when you start to get into vision logic, something called vision logic, you get into the trans-rational realm, and then the trans-rational realms have a huge amount of stuff in them that I have talked about in past episodes and will continue to in the future. But anyways, so the Pre Trans Fallacy is what the scientifically minded or atheistically minded person does is they think that there is no such thing as a trans-rational. They confuse the trans-rational with the pre-rational. And so this communication that I'm having right now with you, many people will be tempted to say, well, Leo, you're talking about God, and you seem so confident and cocky and arrogant about knowing God, and you talk about spirituality and other kinds of mystical things. That means that you're just like one of those fundamentalist Christian type of people. So that's the pre-trans fallacy. This communication is a trans-rational communication, and you need to be able to see that. It's very important, because most of you listening to me are going to be in the rational stage. So from the rational stage, there are some things that you're right about. There are many problems with the pre-rational stage. There are many ways in which it's diluted, full of dogma and untruths. When pre-rational people start to literally interpret the Bible or various holy books and laws and scriptures, they can really go wrong. But while religion is chock full of delusion, you're right about that. And I have many criticisms of religion. Trust me, I've been a critic of religion for a long time, for most of my life. I'm very much allergic to dogma and to ideology and to conformist cult thinking. So while all of that is true about religion, you're still missing one very important thing. There's one thing that religion is right about, fundamentally. And that is that God is an actual phenomenon, not a figment or a creation of the human mind. That's what you're missing. So be open to that possibility. The key insight I have for you in this episode is that God is an experience, not a belief or a theory. God is an actual experience that I have had, many other people have had, and that you can have. And that's even important for you theists to understand. Because the problem with you theists is that you believe in God so much that you confuse your idea and your image of God for God itself. And that actually becomes your greatest obstacle to actually understanding what God is. all of the preconceived ideas that were taught to you and brainwashed into you through Sunday school or wherever you got your beliefs in God from. So don't think that you're out of the woods yet if you're a theist. Superficially, it seems like I'm agreeing with you, the theist, because supposedly I agree that God exists. But actually, in a certain sense, the things that I'm communicating are closer to what the rationalist and the atheist holds than your pre-rational theistic ideas of God as some bearded man in the clouds. Now, of course, the very first objection we got to answer here is that, well, Leo, what are you talking about? Personal experience? You're saying that you experienced God and now you think you know what God is? How arrogant of you. After all, we know that personal experience, man, that's not reliable. People hallucinate all sorts of things. There are people who have all sorts of psychotic visions and things like that, and they misinterpret them, and they think, sometimes people even think that they're God. So Leo, how can you trust your personal experience? What does this really show? This isn't proof. I need solid, concrete proof. I want a double-blind, placebo-controlled study that shows me that there's a God, if there is such a thing. Because, Leo, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. So where's your evidence? So far, all I'm hearing you say is just a bunch of mumbo-jumbo and talking and philosophy, but no real proof. So prove to me, provide to me the tangible evidence, and then maybe I'll agree with you about the existence of God. Such the rationalist and the atheist thinks. And the rationalist actually believes that this is a valid way to think about this problem. Here's the reality of the matter. When you say this objection, you really demonstrate that you don't know and you haven't really thought carefully about what experience is, or what proof is, or even how science works, or how knowledge works. Because in this objection, you're just assuming that proof is a given, and that proof is just an easy thing. It's like you just go and find proof. You find proof for God in the way that you might find proof for some murder. Like you find a knife with blood on it, you do some DNA testing, and then boom, there you go, you've proved it. And in the same way, we can prove God. But that's not how it works. Because when we're talking about God, we're talking about the most fundamental thing ever. We're talking about the origin of existence itself. So as you can clearly see, proof requires that first you have existence. Science and rationality depend on certain fundamental things that need to be in place before they work. See? So what you're not realizing is that proof is actually a second-order phenomenon. We have to build up to proof. Proof is not something we just take for granted. After all, what qualifies as proof? Whose standards for proof are we going to use to prove existence exactly? Your standards, my standards, our community standards, our culture's standards? You're taking all of this completely for granted. Consider that truth or being is prior to proof. Because proof itself requires being in order to get itself off the ground. So here's a little analogy for you. It's as though we have Lego building blocks, and we're going to use these to build a castle. So the Lego building block itself, if we have one block right here, this, let's think of it as truth or as being. These are like the atomic particles that make up everything in our Lego building universe. Proof is a second-order phenomena in the sense that out of these bricks, we can build a castle. The castle is made out of the little bricks. So it's really an emergent second order, right? You can't have a castle without bricks, but you can have bricks without a castle. You see that? You see how the castle depends on the bricks to exist first? Well, that's how proof works. So, in a sense, when you're telling me that you need proof for God, the critical mistake you're making, it's as though in this Lego universe, by way of analogy, it's as though you're asking me to formulate a brick in the shape of a castle. You see, you've put the cart before the horse. You've misunderstood what depends on what, because you're taking the castle as the primary and the brick as the secondary. It's sort of like you're asking me to prove the existence of bricks to you, because all you've ever experienced are castles. You see the problem there? You've got it backwards. It doesn't work like that. If you're familiar with Kurt Gödel's incompleteness theorem, then you should also be familiar with the notion that proof cannot be systematized or symbolized. Or rather, the truth cannot be systematized or symbolized. And that proof is always a weaker notion than truth. If you want to understand that in a much deeper way, go check out my episode on Gödel's incompleteness theorem. It's a very important discovery within epistemology. And it wasn't just Kurt Gödel, but Alfred Tarski was also instrumental in demonstrating that proof will always be less than truth. The domain of truth is everything, and the domain of proof is a subdomain of truth, because proof itself is part of truth, but not the entirety of it. Another way to explain this to you is, prove to me that you exist. How would you do that? You see, the problem with you rationalist types is that you ignore your own direct experiences and the necessity of your own existence and the fact that you are intimately in the world. You're not standing outside of it as some observer outside the universe looking in. You're intimately in the universe. So it's actually not possible to prove that you exist, because existence is more fundamental than proof. The only reason you think you exist is because you feel that you exist, and that happens through personal experience. Or, for example, try to prove that colors exist to a blind person. Think about that. Think about it for a minute, and what you'll realize is that it's not possible. Because for proof to happen, a lot of stuff has to be in place. For proof to happen, we already have to assume existence. We already have to assume a common base of experiences between individuals. And we have to assume that our experiences are similar enough that we can work with each other, we can build a consensus, we can have standards around what qualifies as proof and what doesn't. These standards can be different based on which community or culture you're a part of, which time in history we're talking about, and so forth, right? So proof is a very complex notion that requires a lot of stuff to build it up. It's made of various building blocks, which themselves cannot be proven. So appreciate that. It's not as simple as you think. There are certain things in life that can't be proven, and yet they are true. Consider that possibility, because many scientists and rationalists and atheists, they just assume that everything that's true automatically must be provable, and that's false. That's been demonstrated to be false by Kurt Gödel and Alfred Tarski. Go check that out if you don't believe me. Study their work. Think it through. Moving on, though. The main reason why God doesn't make sense to you is because you're failing to account for different states of consciousness. This is it right here. This is the answer. Because what all of you rationalists basically don't consider is that there could be different states of consciousness, and that rationality and science and proof are only operative within certain states of consciousness and not others. So what do I mean by different states of consciousness? Well, right now, you're in what we might call the conventional physical state of consciousness, the conventional normal waking state. Other states of consciousness that you might have experienced is being drunk. It's a very different state of consciousness. Certain things are open to you in that state, and other things are closed. Every state comes with its own limitations and possibilities. For example, when you're very drunk, you're not going to be able to do logic and science and rationality. But there's other states like dreaming, again, which come with their own possibilities and limitations. There's certain things you can do in your dreams that you can't do in the quote-unquote real world, and vice versa. And then there are rarefied, superhuman, high levels of consciousness, which very few humans have ever accessed, beyond what we consider the highest level. Normally we just consider that this normal waking consciousness is like the highest level of consciousness. Well, that's just not true. That's what you're failing to account for. And so to understand God, what you need to understand is that it's not possible to understand God from your current state of consciousness. You need to raise your state of consciousness significantly, a lot, by 10 or 100 or 1,000-fold. And then you have a chance of understanding. And you see, that's why this communication is so challenging, is because I'm trying to communicate something to you from a high level of consciousness that I gathered down to your current levels of consciousness right now. And so by definition, it's not going to work. It's like I'm trying to explain colors to a blind person. Can't work. The only way you can understand colors is to directly experience colors. What you need to appreciate is that science is a figment of consciousness. You can only do science and rationality because you're in a particular state of consciousness. For example, an ant cannot do science or rationality. An ant's state of consciousness is significantly more limited than that of a human. And this is a great example because think of how limited the ant's universe is compared to what we know as humans. The ant spends its whole life mostly living underground within a small area. And even when it ventures outside, it's still basically living its whole life on, let's say, like 1 square acre of land. The ant doesn't know about galaxies, Jupiter, the moon. The ant doesn't know about humans in many cases, unless he gets stepped on. And even then, he doesn't understand why or what's really going on. The ant doesn't know about all the different creatures and races that exist around the world. The ant knows nothing about language, about math, about science, about history, about philosophy, about art, about entertainment, about pornography. Like, what does the ant know? None of this stuff. The ant's universe is so limited. So now imagine that the current state of consciousness that you're in right now, that you've been in your whole life, and that all of your friends and family and your entire community has been like that ant. And that what you know as the conventional universe is just like that ant's reality, very limited. And that I'm talking about states of consciousness that are 1,000 times greater. Just like, imagine the difference between you and an ant. You might think that an ant probably has 1,000 times less consciousness than you. Well, now imagine someone who's a human but has 1,000 times more consciousness than a standard human. That's a person who can understand God. And unless you become that person, you ain't going to understand God. Another reason you fail to understand God is because you fail to take into account states of cognitive development, which I've already explained to you in the Pre Trans Fallacy. Those 3 stages of pre-rational, rational, post-rational, that was me describing stages of cognitive development. I've also talked in the past about spiral dynamics. That also talks about different stages of cognitive development. So what this means is that, see, ordinarily we just assume that all people are at the same stage, same level of consciousness, which is just not true. The human psyche evolves and grows, as does human culture. And the culture that you're in right now and the stage of development you're in right now is not the highest stage, not even close. So you need to be able to anticipate that stuff that you can't understand at one stage of consciousness, you will at the next stage. And so you need to be open to new stages rather than denying them like most people do. See, that's the mistake people make. People don't like to acknowledge that there are stages because, of course, that means that they have to admit that they're not at the highest stage and they have a lot of growing to do. And of course, they don't want to admit that because especially these rationalist types, they can get very arrogant, intellectually arrogant, thinking that they're so far above and superior to religious, superstitious people that they've figured it all out. Well, I got news for you. You haven't. You're in for a rude awakening. Another reason why you can't make sense of God is because you assume that reality is a material physical system, which is just wrong. Fundamentally, your conception of reality is wrong. Reality is not a physical system, rather reality is a giant mind, which can imagine and think up all sorts of different sub-realities within it, one of which is what we call physical reality, this universe as you know it. So see, if you assume that the universe is just a physical box with objects in it, just kind of like bouncing around like billiard balls, and everything's just random and it's just according to the laws of physics and all of this. If you assume that is what's true, that's what is objective, then your universe is very limited because it's constrained by all that, and you think that that's how it has to be, and that's all that there is. And then, of course, you assume that consciousness comes from the brain, from neurons, and it's just an algorithm, it's just calculations happening in there. You have this very materialistic explanation for the universe, which is wrong. When you assume that, then you're very stuck. You don't open yourself up to those transrational states of consciousness that are possible. Or even if you experience them, you bring them back and you interpret them within your materialist paradigm. And from the materialist paradigm, God makes no sense. It's impossible, it's crazy, it's ridiculous, it's outrageous, it seems childish to even talk about God from within your paradigm. And that's exactly right. The mistake you're making is that you're clinging to your paradigm and you're refusing to actually question your paradigm. Now, the materialist paradigm you tell yourself is scientifically validated and proven. That's not true at all. The paradigm I'm talking about has never been scientifically proven. Science has never demonstrated the existence of an external material objective world. Never, and it never will, and no such thing exists. And of course, science has never demonstrated the existence of other human beings, nor will it ever. You see, these things are metaphysical dogmas of science. Don't you think that science can't have dogmas? Science can definitely have dogmas, and it does. It has many metaphysical and epistemic dogmas, which construct the paradigm. These are just assumptions that are never proven. They're just assumed that that's how it has to be. So that's what needs to be questioned if you really want to understand God. Have you noticed that God is a very controversial and emotional topic for most people? Most people have a very strong opinion about it one way or another. Whether you believe or don't believe, even when you don't believe, you still believe. You just believe in the opposite. Or you believe it's not possible to know. It's very difficult to escape the trap of believing firmly in this stuff. And the reason it's so controversial is because this question of God sits at the very core of your web of belief. And your web of belief is sort of like your operating system, which governs your whole life. And it's fundamental to how you understand reality, how you perceive reality, and how you interact with all aspects of reality, from human beings to objects. Affects your morality, affects what you think is right and wrong, affects how you love, how you hate, affects what kind of things you pursue in your life, what you devote your time and energy to. So it has enormous practical consequences. The mistake that people make is they think that God has no practical consequences. This is just a philosophical topic. That's not the case. In fact, it's just the opposite. It's precisely because the ramifications of realizing what God is are so widespread and so practical, it'll change your entire orientation to life, which is precisely why you're so threatened by it and you get so emotional by it, because the emotions, the dogma, is there as a smokescreen to get you from not deeply investigate this matter for yourself. Because if you ever did, you would discover how wrong your old worldviews were. And then that would be frightening to discover that. That would be a rude awakening. Now, I want you to be honest about what your true attitude is about God. A lot of times people aren't honest about this, theists or atheists. Be honest about, do you think God is a positive thing or a negative thing? Or maybe you believe that there is no such thing as God, it's just all a waste of time. Or maybe you believe, yeah, Leo, there is a God and it looks like this. This is what I imagine God to be. This is what I was told it is in the Quran or in the Bible. Be very honest about your truly held attitude about God. It's that attitude, whatever it is, positive or negative, Or maybe you just have an attitude that it's not possible to know. That attitude is the chief obstacle to you understanding what God is. So, are you willing to surrender that attitude? Or are you going to cling to it and try to defend it at all costs? Now, see, atheists get very tricky here and they say, well, Leo, I don't have an attitude. God is not even a thing. So what attitude? I have no attitude. It's just nothing. Yeah, that's your attitude. See, that's your attitude. Are you willing to give that up? And if you say, no, Leo, I'm not going to give that up because it's not even an attitude. And, I'm not going to open myself up to various kinds of brainwashing. Why should I? Well, that's your attitude, and that's precisely why you'll never understand God. Another question I want you to ask is, have you actually ever experienced God for yourself? Yes or no? And that's very different from believing in God. Have you actually experienced God? Or for you atheists, have you actually experienced that there is no God? Watch out not to confuse your beliefs for experience, because many atheists will say, well, yeah, Leo, I've never experienced God. Therefore, by definition, I've experienced that there is no God. No, you haven't. Just because you haven't experienced God yet doesn't mean that there is no God. See? Watch out. And for you theists who have all sorts of firm convictions in your belief in God, it's very easy for you to confuse your beliefs with an actual experience. Be careful about tricking yourself here. And the last question I want you to ask yourself is, are you directly conscious of God right this second? Because many people have had mystical experiences and trip reports and so forth that they've encountered in the past, but all of that is the past, and now it's just a memory. So are you conscious of God right now? And if you're not conscious of God right now, then, well, you're disconnected from God. You don't really know what it is. All you've got are memories and pleasant stories, interpretations. You see, your interpretations, the way your mind thinks about God, even if you've experienced it, is still very different from actual consciousness of God. Now let's take a look at the biggest misconceptions about God. Perhaps the biggest one is that God is a belief, which I already told you it's not. Another common one is that God is a superstitious religious notion, wishful thinking, and the way that atheists think that really all that God is it's a sort of defense mechanism that naive people adopt in order to avoid facing death. It's the denial of death. People wish for an afterlife, and they wish for more meaning in their life than there really is. They wish for some overarching meaning to life, something beyond just randomness and chaos. And really, what God amounts to is just sort of a defense mechanism against the nihilism of reality, the brute, cold, hard reality that's there, that has no meaning, and it's just a bunch of random chaos. This is also a misconception. Now, of course, it's true that many people in the world who are at the pre-rational stage of development, in fact, do use religion and God as a sort of crutch to face some tough philosophical realities, to deny death, to deny meaninglessness and certain truths within nihilism. That's correct. Certain people do that, but that's not the origin of the notion of God. That's precisely the Pre Trans Fallacy that I'm talking about. So another common misconception is that God is a bearded man in the sky. I've read many books by great scientists, quantum physicists, cosmologists, and astrophysicists, where they argue against God, but the God they're arguing against is the bearded man in the sky conception of God, which of course is not really what God is. It's so silly. How a scientist could actually even argue against this conception of God is ridiculous. That's not what God is. God is also not a man, not a he, not a creature, not a being, and not even a thing. So already you should start to understand the difficulty of understanding God if God is none of these things. Because what do you know? The only thing you know are things, beings, creatures. And God is something else. So that's what makes it so tricky. Another common misconception is that God is incompatible with science, evolution, technology, or advanced society. And whenever God is explained to an atheist, in the back of the atheist's mind, there's always sort of a suspicion, because in his mind, he's like, well, but if I accept God, if we carry on this conversation further, then that's going to mean that we're somehow now denying science or evolution or technology. And I know that those things are true, and so God must therefore be false. But that's a false dichotomy. In fact, both can be true. And that's what the transrational domain is all about. You get to keep science and evolution and technology, but you also go beyond them. Another common misconception is that God has rules that you must follow. That God looks down upon you and judges you and punishes evildoers and sinners, and that your role in life is not to be a sinner. This is false. God doesn't punish anyone. God doesn't judge anyone. God doesn't care what you do or don't do, and has no rules that you must follow. You are given total freedom. In fact, that's the ultimate nature of God, and that's why God is so difficult for many mere mortals to understand, is because God gives you total freedom to do anything you want. If you want to be a murderer, God is fine with you being a murderer. If you want to be a rapist, God is fine with you being a rapist. And that's very difficult for people to accept, because pre-rational people like to use God to justify their cultural norms. So you have to separate cultural norms and morality from God. It's really problematic when you conflate those two. Another common misconception is that God is exclusive to one religion. Either the Christian God is right, or the Muslim God is right, or the Hindu God is right, the Jewish God is right, but they can't all be right. Or it's the notion that my religion has the one right God and all the other ones are wrong. This is a false notion. No religion has a monopoly on God. And all of these religions are talking about the same one God. There's not as much diversity within religion as people would think. Most atheistic people and scientifically minded people, they actually use this as an argument against the validity of God, is they say, well, but Leo, if God really existed, then surely every religion would agree upon what God is. Well, they basically do. And now you'll say, but Leo, but what about like the Hindus? They have many gods. They don't have one God. So what are you talking about? I mean, yeah, maybe the Christian God and the Jewish God, maybe they're the same God. And maybe even the Muslim God is the same God, which of course it is. Allah is the same as the Christian God. But what about the Buddhists? The Buddhists don't even have a God, Leo. And the Hindus, they have many different avatars, and they have a Vishnu and a Ganesha and a Lakshmi and a Krishna and a Shiva and a blah, 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 right? So which one is the right one? And what about the Greeks and the Romans? They had all kinds of different gods. So how can you say that they're all one? Well, they are. Fundamentally, if you know how to interpret religious texts, which is a tricky science, learning how to interpret religious texts, it's not easy. See, if you interpret them literally, then of course you've got a million different gods by different names, and they have different qualities, and so you're so confused, and it seems like it's all contradiction, and everyone's just making shit up. Well, that's not really the case. If you properly read the scriptures and you know how to interpret them, and more importantly, when you have a direct experience of God for yourself, you realize that there's only one God, and that all these religions are fundamentally talking about one God. And for example, in Hinduism, even though they have many different avatars, fundamentally they have one God, which is Shiva or Brahman. And the rest, they're just different facets, different aspects of God, which are symbolized and talked about metaphorically through different minor deities and incarnations and avatars and so forth. And this has been the case not just in Hinduism, but really everywhere. Even within Christianity and within Islam, there are always polytheistic strands and various aspects. And in Christianity, they talk about the Holy Trinity, and they talk about the Holy Spirit, which is separate from Jesus, which is separate from God. So all of this, I mean, you can subdivide God into a million different ways, which is what every religion does, every culture does. But fundamentally, they're all talking about the same stuff. And the last misconception, and this is a biggie, is that God is other than you. This is so counterintuitive for people to get. What do you mean, Leo? God is other than me. How can God be me? That sounds stupid. But on the other hand, how could God be other than you? We're going to get back to this point because it's a very big point. But for now, I'll just tell you that if you think that God is something separate from you, like God is some rarefied metaphysical object that hangs out outside the universe somewhere, hidden behind the scenes in some dark corner, some dark recess of the universe, you've got it wrong. God is you. But of course, that means you're going to have to change how you conceive of yourself and also how you conceive of God to bring those two things together. And you're going to have to make sense of that. And right now, in your current state of consciousness, it makes no sense because you don't have a sense of being God. It's like, Leo, if I'm God, then how come I can't just like create stuff out of thin air? How come I can't just think of $1 billion and have it materialize here in a stack of gold bars? How come I can't make that wall disappear in front of me? And you're right, you can't do those things because you're in this limited human form. But even though all that's the case, you are still God. You see, God is all about limitation. So we'll get back to that. So let's now directly address the question of what is God. And the way I want to approach this is the way that they might in an introductory philosophy class in a university. Like if you took Philosophy 101, then they would introduce you to all sorts of philosophical concepts, and of course one of them would have been God. And in Western intellectual tradition, in Western philosophy, God is defined in a sort of classical standard way, which I want to present to you right here. And then let's take a look at these different facets of God that are described. Let's take a look at how many of them are correct. Which ones are correct? Which ones are false? That's going to be interesting to do. So here's how it's classically defined. God is the supreme being, the first cause. God is the source of all creation. And by creation, we mean creation with a capital C. We mean the entire universe and all the multiverses, everything. Anything that is real. God is also said to be infinite, boundless, the all, the one, the absolute. God is also omniscient, or all-knowing, all-intelligent. God is also omnipotent, having unlimited power and the ability to create anything that it wants. God is omnipresent, which means that it's present everywhere. There's nowhere in the universe that God is not. Which, of course, is interesting because that ties in with that point about God being you. See, if God is omnipresent, he would have to be inside of you as well. Sometimes I say God is a he, but you have to understand that God is not a he. If I say that, that's just, in the parlance of sort of colloquial speaking, but God is not a he. More properly is to call it an it. Also, God is said to be benevolent, or all-loving and good with a capital G. God is said to be incorporeal, eternal and immortal, and perfect and complete. So that's basically the classic Western definition. Now, the question is, how much of those are correct? And the answer is all of them. This is precisely the correct definition of God. The problem is accepting it and understanding how this can possibly be. So the reason that I'm saying that all of these are correct is because over the last 3 years, through my consciousness work, I have directly validated in my direct experience all of these facets. So I'm not just telling you because I've read this stuff someplace, but I have validated for myself that God is the supreme being, the first cause, the source of creation, infinite, boundless, the all, the one, the absolute, that God is omniscient and all-knowing and intelligent to the infinite degree, omnipotent with unlimited power, omnipresent. I've verified that as well. I've verified that God is benevolent and all-loving and good with a capital G. I've verified that God is incorporeal, eternal, immortal, perfect, and complete. But how can that be? How is it possible to verify such things, you might wonder? Well, we'll get to that, so hold on. Now, let's go a little bit deeper into this definition and explain more of these sorts of facets of God. So God is a radical state of consciousness. But also at the same time, God is all states of consciousness. So don't think that you need to be in a particular state of consciousness in order to experience God, or that God exists only in one state of consciousness. God exists everywhere, including this state of consciousness you're in right now. The only problem is that this present state of consciousness you're in right now, you're not conscious that this state of consciousness is a facet of God. Imagine if your consciousness expanded and exploded by 1,000-fold. That's what God is. God is also the absence of self, or you. Now, this seems to contradict what I said earlier, because earlier I just said, you are God. So Leo, how is it possible that God is the absence of me, but also me? Well, that's exactly right. That's the paradox. Both are the case. The way we explain this is God is the absence of you as your limited egoic identity. That thing you identify with, that you tell yourself was born, that has a life story, that personal you, the biological you, the you that you think is a creature, that you is a false conceptual self. So God is the absence of that. If you get rid of that thing, you will experience yourself as God. But then what remains of you? Well, nothing really. You experience yourself as pure emptiness. When we strip all qualities away from you, all that remains is just a state of pure, empty consciousness or awareness, and that's what God is. So this is you with a capital Y. You have to distinguish that from the conventional you that we normally talk about, the biological you, the biographical you. That's the false you. That thing has to die. In fact, that is the greatest obstacle to you realizing God. You are the obstacle, you see. And that's why this topic is so tricky. Because how do you get rid of you? You want to see God, and yet the thing that's in the way of you seeing God is yourself. God is also synonymous with reality, existence, and truth. So, in a sense, the atheist and the rationalist and the scientist, they do subscribe to God, but they call their God reality. They call their God nature or existence. But of course, they object when I say this, because a rationalist will say, but Leo, sure, yeah, I believe in reality and in nature, but that's not what God is. Now, see, Leo, you're redefining things. See, Leo, you're playing a word game here. Because if God refers to reality, then why do we even need the word God? Why bring in religious connotations and spiritual stuff when we can just say reality is just like this machine? It's got no God-like qualities. It's just a machine. So stop calling it God. But you see, that's not what I mean. The word God does refer to reality, existence, and nature. But the problem is that you, as a rationalist, as an atheist, as a scientist, are not conscious of what reality or nature or existence actually are. If you were really conscious, you would realize that they are God. Now, why do we call it God? Because that's the most appropriate word when you become conscious of what reality is. it's conscious, and it's divine. And these are inherently baked into reality. And this is the thing that the atheist, the rationalist, and the scientist doesn't understand. Because the atheist, the rationalist, and the scientist treats reality, like I said before, as a mechanical system. And God is not a mechanical system. Reality is not a mechanical system. It's a giant mind. That is what you're missing as an atheist. So really, you have, as an atheist, created a sort of false God for yourself that you believe in and take completely on blind faith. And which that is, what that is that that's mechanical reality, an external objective reality that human beings can study with science. That thing doesn't exist. You invented that, and that is your God. And that is the thing that you cling to, just like the religious fundamentalists cling to their notions of God as a bearded man in the clouds. God is consciousness, pure consciousness. The thing in you right now, which is conscious of anything, conscious of existence, that's God. The problem is that for the rationalist, for the materialist, for the atheist, they think of consciousness in a very weak way. They think of consciousness as something that the brain does, as consciousness being something that exists within a physical, mechanical universe. That's not what consciousness is. There is only consciousness. There is no physical, mechanical universe. All of that is content within consciousness. Consciousness is disembodied. Consciousness is not a computer simulation running somewhere. Consciousness is not happening in a brain. All of those things, your computer simulations and brains and big bangs and universes and science and rationality, all of that is content within consciousness. Now you might say, but how does the consciousness occur? Well, exactly, see? You don't understand yet. You haven't awoken yet. If you were awake and you were conscious of what consciousness is, you would realize that consciousness is singular and has no opposite, and that it is pure magic, pure irreducible magic. And that's the thing that you're avoiding as a scientist from acknowledging. And that's why you deny this. See, because there's no rational explanation for it, and you're looking for a rational explanation. You're looking to demystify reality. And as it turns out, that is impossible. That's a false assumption that you can demystify reality. God is also being. What is being? Being is the only thing that there is. Being is everything. Everything is being. Everything in this room, my face, my hands, the sounds coming out of my mouth, all of this is being. Well, then you would say, but Leo, so if all that's being, then all of this must be God. But I don't see a God here. Where's the God? What kind of word games are you playing? The reason you don't see the God, even though it's right here, this is God. Hello, wake up. This is God right here. Your entire life has always been God. The problem is that you're not interfacing directly with being. You are interpreting being all the time. And so your interpretations and projections onto being create a sort of smoke screen that doesn't allow you to directly be being, and therefore you're constantly disconnected from it, and therefore you're not realizing what it actually is. You're not realizing the significance of it. And so what needs to happen is that you need to remove all of your interpretations, all of your beliefs, and everything that you know, such that, imagine, if you could remove all of your interpretations of reality completely, you wouldn't know what anything is. You wouldn't even know that I'm a human being. You wouldn't know that I'm Leo. You wouldn't know whether I'm good or bad. You wouldn't know whether I'm tasty or not tasty. You wouldn't know whether you should mate with me or not mate with me. You wouldn't know anything. You wouldn't even know that I'm an object. You wouldn't know what I am. You wouldn't know what any objects are. You wouldn't even know what you are. You would be in a complete state of not knowing. But what you would have is pure being, stripped of all knowledge and all interpretations, all meanings, all values, everything. So at the same time, you wouldn't know what anything is, but you would have being. And in that very moment, you would have God. You would realize God as pure being. So the biggest obstacle to you realizing God is all of the interpretations that you're making constantly, that you're not aware that you're making. See, we just kind of like look around the world and we think, well, the world is just made up of like trees and cars and lights and walls and people and animals and blah, 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 blah. No, it's not. Your mind is creating all of those projections and interpretations. So what's actually there is only pure being, but you are making sense of it such that it helps you in your survival. See, so you're recognizing stuff that's not really there. You're sort of projecting it, and that needs to stop. And that's why it's so difficult to realize God, is because we're making these projections and interpretations constantly, and so under the radar of our awareness that we don't even know we're doing it. And so for most people, there's no possibility of stopping it. And stopping it is pretty difficult because it's tied in with your survival drive. And so it's life-threatening to do so. God is also now, the present moment of now. Now is the only thing that is real. Not the past, not the future. Now, right here, this very moment, this is God. But what is now? It's a good question. Have you ever wondered? Take a look. I mean, it's happening right now. It's happening all the time. There's nothing but now. But what exactly is it? See, it's kind of mysterious. You don't know how to put your finger on it. And that's the whole problem with God, is that you can't put your finger on it in the way that you can when we're talking about a star or the earth or a human being or an animal or a rat in a laboratory. God, in fact, is the one thing that can't be pointed to, because the thing that's pointing to God is itself God. If God is everything, which it is, then you see the problem this creates. This means that it can't be pointed to. Because if I say, well, this finger here is God, so I'm pointing to it, and you will look at it and say, okay, well, maybe Leo's pointing at God here, but what is he pointing with? The words he's using, the other finger he's using to point to it, and your own mind, the ideas your own mind is using to think about this finger as God, all of those are also God. So how do we point to those? Now I have to use this finger to point to this finger because this is also God. So see, fingers pointing at fingers, it goes round in a circle. So you're going to be going round in a circle if you're going to try to use your mind to grasp God, and you're always going to be missing it because it's like right here all the time. It's prior to interpretation, prior to language, prior to the mind. See? So this is why it's so difficult to get, because the process of getting it is itself getting in the way of having it. See? You know why you can't know that you're God? Because you are God. Are means you are being God. Being is prior to knowing. So the mistake is that you're trying to know God without realizing that knowledge is already one step too far. You need to be God, not know it. Also, what God is non-duality, no boundaries or oneness. Non-duality means that there's really no distinction between things, no boundaries. So the boundaries that we classically use to think and understand the world with, like male versus female, good versus bad, big versus small, existing versus non-existing, conscious versus unconscious, one versus two, here versus there. All of these are dualities, categories that we've created. And so God is the elimination of all these categories, or the unification of all categories, to realize that actually even those distinctions, in a sense, they do exist. At the same time, they are all unified and one. The entire universe, or all of reality, is one thing. And you can become conscious of that. And to become conscious of the oneness of reality is to become conscious of God. And of course, when we're talking about oneness, don't exclude yourself from that oneness. You, as an object within reality, are part of the whole oneness, you see. So this is why God can't be separate from you. Because if God was over there, and I was over here, and I'm looking at God over there, that means that I am not God because I'm separate from God. But if I'm separate from God, how did I get created? You see, because God's creation isn't something that God does sitting outside the creation. God is his own creation. God is the very thing he's creating, or it is creating, to say it more accurately. So right now what's happening is that ostensibly I'm sitting here, I'm a human being, I'm sitting here before you in front of a camera, speaking to you through some computer system that you're looking at, through some LCD screen, some pixels, and you're listening to me and interpreting the things I'm saying, and I'm using English, and it seems like that's what's going on here. That's not what's really going on here. What's going on here is that God is happening. This whole process is God. Oneness. Oneness is happening. The entire universe is like one movement happening in concert together. Like one show or one movie. You know, like in a movie, you can think of a movie as being made out of separate stuff, like there's lamps and cars and trees and sidewalks and buildings and people in a movie. But also you can realize that the whole movie is just one thing. Like one digital file, if it's on your computer, or one DVD disc, if you've got it like that. See, and you can look at it both as both. Both are true simultaneously. So yes, in a certain sense, I am just a human being sitting here talking to you. But in another higher sense, all of this is God happening. God is also a strange loop. Now, strange loop is a bit of a technical term. To really understand what that means, go watch my episode called Reality is a Strange Loop, where we go into that with some cool visual examples. Check that out. But what a strange loop is it basically means that God created itself. This is a very tricky notion to glimpse. God created itself. You might wonder, Leo, how is it possible for God to create itself? That's impossible. It's impossible from your current state of consciousness because you're trying to rationally think it through. And rationally, linearly, using conventional logic, it's not possible for a thing to create itself. But God is not limited to that. See, when you realize that God is infinite power, infinite intelligence, it actually has the power to create itself, which is quite stunning and mind-blowing. And it's a very elegant solution to the question of where did existence come from? And where did God come from? You know, for the longest time, the reason that I never bought into God when I was younger, when I was an atheist, I always thought like, well, what's the point of believing in God? Because God is just another object. And so God doesn't really explain anything, because if you say the universe came from God, like if the Big Bang came from God, then where did God come from? You need another God to create that God, and so on for infinity. Yeah, but what you don't realize is that God itself is infinity. And because it is infinity, it accounts for everything, absolutely everything, every possibility. And so therefore, it did create itself. Another way to say it is that God exists for eternity. It both created itself, but also simultaneously it has always existed and never needed creation. This is far-fetched stuff. You're not going to understand it logically if that's what you're trying to do. It's not going to make sense. You need to directly experience it. For example, I directly experienced one day how I created my entire body as God, how I designed every hair and every molecule on my arm. So imagine a state of consciousness where you can be conscious of that. That's a pretty mind-blowing thing. God is also absolute infinity, as I said. Absolute infinity. That means, wow, infinity. How do you explain infinity to somebody? Actual infinity. Actual infinity. That's what this moment is right now. This moment is one out of an entire infinite of moments. I remember one day I became conscious that consciousness is absolutely infinite, and that it goes on forever and ever and ever. And it contains every possibility forever and ever and ever, such that it's so total that there's nothing not inside of it. That's a mindfuck. God is also everything and nothing. So this is what's so paradoxical about God. So my hand is God. My face is God. Every word coming out of my mouth is God. Your body is God. Any thoughts you have are God. Any objections you have to anything I'm saying, that's also God. But at the same time, God is still not any of that. How can both be true at the same time? Well, they just are. You need to become conscious that this is the case. Because God is consciousness, and consciousness is not a thing, it's not located anywhere. And a thing that's not located anywhere is actually, it turns out, exactly the same as everything. To be nothing is to be everything, and to be everything is to be nothing. That's the reconciliation of the ultimate duality. See, conventionally we think of there's everything and there's nothing, and they're polar opposites. No, they're not. They're actually identical, and they overlap, and they sit right on top of each other. In the same way that if you have an object floating out in the vacuum of empty space, you might think, well, the object occupies the vacuum. And so in that place where the object is, let's say you have a hammer floating out in outer space, you would say, in that place where there's a hammer, there isn't a vacuum. Actually, no, the vacuum is there. The nature of a vacuum is that it's always there. The vacuum of empty space is right here, right now. My body is inside the vacuum of empty space. Of course, there's also air and other things here. But the vacuum doesn't go away. The vacuum is always present. Stop thinking of a vacuum as being only when it's empty of objects. The vacuum is empty even when there's objects in it. You just don't normally think of it that way because you think dualistically. And God is also the answer to all questions. Now, what does this mean? Well, this means it's the answer to all metaphysical and epistemic questions. So all the big philosophical questions that you think can't be resolved, like why are we here? What are humans doing here? Why do we exist? Where did it all come from? Why is there something rather than nothing? All of that can be answered by becoming conscious of God fully. And these answers are extremely satisfying and complete, such that you have no more questions left. But you're not going to get answers to things like, what did your neighbor have for lunch? Or an answer to some scientific question, because these are all relative questions. And God is the answer to the existential, metaphysical, absolute questions, not the relative stuff. You're not going to know how many liters of gas there are in your fuel tank in your car. So, nor do you really need to know that stuff. That's all minutia, right? The problem is that people get caught up on the minutia, and they think, well, Leo, but it, you know, what good is knowing God if knowing God doesn't help me to figure out how to solve some scientific problem that I have? Well, your scientific problem doesn't concern God. What we're talking about is we're talking about the origin of all of existence. So forget about your little stupid little scientific problems or any other kind of personal problems that you have. You can work on those later if you even think of them as problems anymore after you realize what existence is. Now, of course, people wonder, well, Leo, this stuff you're talking about, it all sounds so outlandish. How can any of this be? How can God have created himself? How can God be everything and nothing? And all the other stuff you said. And the answer to it is that it just is. You see, there's a funny thing about truth. Truth just is. People think truth can be proven. No, it can't. Truth just is. Truth can't be proven. People think truth can be explained or justified. You can give reasons for why things are. No, you can't. Truth just is. And it's your job to realize that and to stop looking for justifications, endless justifications and reasons and explanations. See, this is what the mind is always doing, and this is the classic mistake of the scientific mind. It doesn't realize that at some point when we're investigating reality, we're going to get to rock bottom. We're going to get to the most ultimate fundamental thing. And when we get there, we have to accept it as it is, as a given, as a self-evident element that can't be reduced any further. And that's where we're hitting here. So when you realize God, you realize that it's the most fundamental element of existence. You can't get underneath consciousness because There is nothing there. In fact, that's what consciousness is the realization that there's nothing there, and there never was anything there to begin with. It just is. But if you're still asking, but Leo, how could it be this way? And it's impossible. That's because you still haven't actually become conscious that it just is. You still don't understand what isness is. And of course, isness is just synonymous with God and with existence. And you might say, well, Leo, all this sounds way too good to be true. That's right. And that's one of the reasons why people have a hard time actually grasping it or pursuing it. Because it makes you sound crazy to pursue this stuff. It makes you sound crazy to believe this stuff. You can't really believe it. You have to directly become conscious of it. You might wonder, what does God look like or feel like? And there's some good things we can say about this. God feels like awakening from a dream. That's a very good description of it, which is why we call it awakening or enlightenment. I remember when I had one of my deepest awakenings, it was so shocking and startling that I just sat there with my mouth agape in my room, just like stunned like this, and I was just like kind of like babbling to myself, and I was just babbling one word. Awakening. 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 I'm awake. I'm awake. I'm awake. Like I'm awake for the first time in my life. I'm awake. It's just like waking up from a dream. So imagine that everything that's happening right now, including me sitting here, talking to you, you sitting there trying to figure this stuff out for yourself, all of this is just a dream. And that when you discover God, you can realize that all your entire biographical life, from the moment you were born up till right now, has all just been a figment of one's imagination within consciousness. This very moment that's happening right now is God imagining this moment. Because what God is God is a universal mind. That means that physical wall behind you, the floor you're sitting on, the entire earth, all the physical stuff that you thought was there the whole time, that was objective and real, that grounded your reality, all of that is just a figment of your imagination. And now, that does not mean that you have the power to think the floor out of existence. You have to understand that when I talk about the figment of the imagination of God, we're talking about a much more robust concept than what we traditionally think of as imagination. Conventionally, we think of imagination as just like, oh yeah, we're just thinking stuff up in the human mind, in the human brain, images and thoughts. Of course, that is imagination, but you're also ignoring that imagination is a much broader thing which actually encompasses all of reality. This very moment is being imagined. It's not a physical thing that exists anywhere. It's being imagined by God. And what is God? Nothing. So this very moment is nothing. It's not that God has a brain. God doesn't look like a human with a skull and a brain inside of it that has consciousness in it according to the materialist paradigm. That's not how it works. The way it works is that this very moment is an imagination within the mind of God, but this very moment is also identical with the mind of God. So another way you can think of it is that wall, that floor, my face, the voice coming out, think of this as, this is the brain of God. This is the machinery of God. The physical machinery of God, so to speak, putting it into the materialist frame, is identical with the consciousness or the mind. The brain and the mind are actually one thing. And how does God's brain or mind look like? Precisely this very moment. Look, this is God right here. This is God's mind. This is God's brain. Can you see it? What else does God feel like? It feels like dying. It feels like the end of life as you know it. And this is why God is so difficult for most people to pursue and to finally grasp, is because who wants to die? Do you want to face your death? As an atheist, you think you faced your death? No, you haven't. You don't know what death is. See, you spend your whole life avoiding death. And the funny thing is that collectively as a culture, what we have labeled death is actually God. We've literally named the realization of God death, and we hold it as the worst, most terrifying thing possible. And we try to avoid it at all costs. So our entire society and culture is built around the avoidance of death. We've demonized death, and we view death as the worst possible thing that could happen. When actually, all that happens when you die is you become God. You realize God, you wake up. You get this? The only thing that's going to die is your idea of physical reality and your idea of you as a biological self. Nothing real is going to die. So in a sense, there's no such thing as death. Death is a concept that you've imagined. God cannot die because God is infinite, so God has no place to go. Where's God going to go if he dies? He ain't got nowhere to go because he's already nowhere and nothing. See? So when you realize that, it will feel like death to you because you've been identified with being this biological creature your whole life, and you've thought that physical reality was real your whole life. So when that's taken away from you, it is like death, and you will be terrified by it. God also feels like a total surrender. Imagine if from this day on, you completely surrendered all control of your life. All of it. So you know that all that struggle you do every day, all the manipulation you do, all the scheming, all the hard work, all the effort that you put into life to trying to make things turn out the way you want. Imagine if you just said, fuck it, I'm surrendering everything. I'm not going to try anymore at all. I'm just going to all leave it up to God. I'm going to leave it up to the universe. Whatever the universe wants to do, I'll just do that. That would be taking your ego out of life, which is precisely the realization of God. And then imagine living your whole life under this constant state of total surrender, where you don't feel like you have separate control over the universe anymore. That's what God feels like. God also feels like the dissolution of all boundaries, because you enter this state, once you're fully awake, you enter this state of non-dual awareness, where all the dualistic categories of life versus death, man versus woman, good versus bad, all of them melt away, all of them merge into one. And that's what allows you to feel the oneness with the entire universe. God also feels like a mindfuck or an epiphany. It is the biggest mindfuck ever. You haven't experienced a mindfuck until you've glimpsed God or awoken. And you know, the word epiphany, colloquially, we just use that word as like someone who has an insight, an epiphany, an insight. But really, that's a word from the Christian tradition, from the Christian lexicon. And what it means, originally what it meant, was the realization of God. It's an epiphany. That's literally what it is. It also feels like the words wow and oh my God. OMG. Chances are when you realize God for the first time, the words out of your mouth will be wow, 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 or oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. It feels simultaneously awesome and terrifying. It's awesome because it's so big and infinite and so beautiful, and it's terrifying because it eclipses and threatens your little ego and your personal identity and your biological, biographical self. It also feels like exiting the Matrix. You know, the movie The Matrix, where Neo discovers that the Matrix is just a computer simulation, and then he breaks free of it, and then he looks out onto the quote-unquote real world outside the Matrix, and he's blown away by how grim and horrific it is out there and all of this. And so there's this stark difference between what's inside the Matrix and what's outside the Matrix. So finally he's broken free. That's what it feels like. Except when you really wake up and you leave the Matrix that we've called reality, the Matrix within which we do science, when you leave that, what's outside the Matrix? Nothing. See, that's where the movie The Matrix really faltered, is that in the movie, they exit the Matrix, but the place they exit to is fundamentally like no different really than the place they left. Inside the Matrix, outside the Matrix. I mean, yeah, the content is different. There's robots outside the Matrix, and it's kind of dark and grim and dirty. But the laws of physics are the same, logic and rationality, and it's basically the same universe, inside and outside. But when you realize the Matrix that is real life and physical science and existence, you also realize that there's nothing outside of it, which is even more freaky than discovering that this is a computer simulation. It's more radical than that. And it simultaneously leaves you in the Matrix, but transforms the Matrix in a profound way. And also, it feels like you can't tell the people in the Matrix that you've exited the Matrix because they won't understand you. All right, so Neo goes back in the Matrix and he does stuff, but most of the people in the Matrix, they don't know he has broken out of the Matrix. And so if he tells them about the outside world, outside the Matrix, they'll think he's insane, which is probably what you think of me right now. You think I'm insane. The things I'm saying here are completely insane. They're completely impossible. Right, because you're stuck in the Matrix. And you won't know you're stuck in the Matrix until the day that you break free of the Matrix. And when that happens, you'll be saying, oh my fucking God, how is this possible? How could I have missed this? It's so obvious. And yet at the same time, it's so seductive and deceptive. God also feels like a metaphysical orgasm. Hopefully you've had regular orgasms, sexual ones. But a metaphysical orgasm is 1,000 times more powerful and life-transforming than a physical orgasm. You don't even know what an orgasm is until you've had a metaphysical orgasm. It also feels like a cosmic holographic fractal. I remember one day I became conscious of this very distinctly. This was a very discrete, specific insight that I had. I was sitting on the floor and I was looking at my hands, and I realized that the entire universe is a cosmic holographic fractal. Now that sounds like a bit of a word salad there. What am I really saying? Some New Age terms, but no. What I'm saying is that the cosmos, which is everything, and everything you think about space, the galaxies and all of that, there's no separation between the galaxies and me sitting here right now and my hands. And in fact, I can keep zooming in with consciousness. I was actually able to zoom into my hands and realize that I can zoom into them forever. You think like, well, if you zoom into this hand with a microscope, eventually you'll hit rock bottom and there will be like atoms or quarks or something or strings, and then you'll get to the bottom. But no, it just keeps going forever. This hand is infinite. My head is infinite. The galaxy is infinite. It just keeps going forever. You can keep zooming out forever and you can keep zooming in forever. And in this sense, it's a fractal. And it's holographic in the sense that every point of consciousness contains within it the rest of the universe, like a hologram. And I remember there was a specific moment where I became conscious of the holographic nature of consciousness, which was stunning and mind-blowing. It also feels like the entire universe is being aware through your eyes. I remember this as well. I became distinctly aware how the entire universe is not some separate thing from me. I am not in the universe, like an object in the universe, the way a materialist conceives of it. I am the universe, and what the universe is this conscious thing that's sitting here right now and talking. The universe is that thing right there that's listening to me. You are the universe. Can you become conscious of this? The universe is aware through your eyes. The hands that you can move, these are the universe's hands. The universe is using you like a puppet. Try to notice that. God also feels like universal mind, like idealism and solipsism. So if you're familiar with Western philosophy, you might be familiar with these concepts of idealism and solipsism. Idealism is the opposite of realism or materialism. Idealism tells us that there's no such thing as physical objects or external reality. There's only mind stuff, and that everything is mind stuff. And solipsism tells us that there's no such thing as other sentient entities. There's only you. And that's exactly right. As God, you are all alone. Oneness necessarily implies aloneness. God doesn't have friends. There also aren't multiple gods. And this is another common question that I had when I was younger, when I didn't believe in God. I wondered, like, well, but why would there be only one God? Why wouldn't there be two or three? Isn't it kind of arbitrary to only believe in one? Isn't that kind of silly? There could be a million gods. But no, what I didn't realize, and what you might not realize, is that the reason that it has to be one is precisely because it's infinite. Absolute infinity. There can only be one absolute infinity because absolute infinity already includes everything. You see, it's totality. So what other kind of gods you might be imagining, include those in the idea of infinity. It's all of that plus more. Imagine everything you could possibly imagine that exists and add even more to it until you become so full that you can't be any more full. And at that point, you've reached absolute infinity. And at that point, you realize the oneness of everything. And at that point, you realize that there is only one God. There could be lesser gods, but they really wouldn't be God per se. There can only be one ultimate God, the absolute. Lesser gods wouldn't really be absolute. They would be something else. You know, there could be space aliens out there. Who knows what's out there? There could be a lot of different stuff out there, but all of it is ultimately one, and you can become conscious of that. But also at the same time, what I'm talking about, the realization of God, is not limited to solipsism. Because the problem with solipsism is that it still doesn't go far enough. It's still not as radical as what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is non-duality. And the difference is that solipsism is still mostly conceptual and theoretical. It's not actual. You're not actually conscious of solipsism. And also the problem with solipsism is that it still assumes that there's a biographical, biological self which exists, which of course gets eliminated through non-duality. God also feels like emptiness and nothingness. But it's not the kind of nothingness or emptiness you're thinking of. It's different. It's almost the opposite. This emptiness feels light and radiant and full. It's a pregnant emptiness, or a plenum, as the Greeks knew it. A plenum. It's a full emptiness, pure potential, ready to burst with infinite possibility. That's fundamentally what consciousness and God are. God is also, it also feels like infinite intelligence, infinite power and creativity, infinite understanding. And that's why God is called omniscient. I remember one of my biggest epiphanies and mindfucks was when I became distinctly conscious of the infinite intelligent aspect of God. Go check out my episode, What is Intelligence?, where I talk about that. And I literally became conscious of pure intelligence, disembodied intelligence, intelligence to the infinite degree. It's so intelligent that it figured out how to create itself. And it's creating this very moment that's here right now. The intelligence that I'm using right now to speak to you, and the intelligence that you're using right now to understand what I'm saying, all of this is just little tiny slivers of universal infinite intelligence. And this intelligence is baked into the design of the entire universe. So, contrary to what the materialists believe, there's nothing random about the universe. It's not chaotic and accidental. It is deliberately designed using disembodied infinite intelligence. And you can become directly conscious of that. This is not something you believe. This is something you verify. It's incredible. When I experienced it, I could hardly believe it. God also feels like infinite beauty. You know, sort of how, like, when you go out in nature and you experience a beautiful sunset or some mountain range, or you look up at the stars and it's so beautiful and wonderful, and you feel a little bit of that spiritual connection to reality. Well, imagine that times infinity, and you get infinite beauty when you realize the beauty of your own creation, that all of creation is just this beautiful work of art that God is constantly performing. And I'm sitting here right now, talking to you through this camera, and this is God performing its work of art. And this is just one out of an infinite number of works of art that God is producing all the time. Even all the stuff you think is ugly, it's actually still beautiful. From the right state of consciousness. Not from your current egoic state of consciousness, because see, you're so judgmental. You're too judgmental to see the beauty of everything. When you remove that ego, then you can see it. God also feels like profound peace. It feels like time stops. It feels like eternity, because it is eternal. The present moment is eternal. This is what's happening right now. It seems like it's happening within time and space, but actually this is an eternal moment. At the right state of consciousness. Not for you in your dualistic state of consciousness. You need a much higher state of consciousness to see the eternalness of this moment. Which is why God can't be killed or destroyed. Because God is nothing, so there's nothing within it to kill or destroy, and therefore it exists forever. This moment that's happening right now, can you become conscious that it's existed forever within the singularity that is God? Probably not, but you can try, and ultimately you can succeed in realizing that. God also is immortality. See, once you realize that you exist as an idea, as a conceptual construction, that there is no such thing as a biological creature or a brain that is responsible for creating this right here, then you realize that you're immortal as God. See, if you're identified with your body and your biography, that will of course die. And in that sense, you're scared of death. But when you identify yourself with all of existence, that can't die. It's immortal. Now you might say, oh, Leo, but what about the Big Bang? You know, the Big Bang, what if the Big Bang turns into a big crunch? Wouldn't that be the death of the universe? I'm talking about a different universe than what you're talking about. Scientists, when they say universe, they're talking about a very specific thing. Our little universe. And there could be multiverses outside of it and so forth to infinity. And in fact, there are. It doesn't stop at our universe. It just keeps going forever. When I'm talking about universe, I'm talking about universe with capital U, which means everything, all the multiverses, every possible thing. That thing, the universe with capital U, that thing can't die. It's immortal. It's infinite. God also feels like the greatest gift, like it's too good to be true. It feels like the greatest joy, a joy beyond your wildest dreams, infinite joy. It feels like actual paradise, heaven, or nirvana. You don't even know what joy is until you've fully realized God. God also feels like you. So if you go inside of yourself right now, you go past your biological body, past your emotions, past your thoughts, past your feelings, past any stories you have or beliefs you have about yourself, past your personal identity, past your self-image. If you go past all that, what you'll feel inside of you is pure I amness, pure consciousness. That's what you've been from the moment you were born, is really you were pure consciousness filled with various kinds of content. Biological, biographical, historical, psychological, social, all sorts of content. So if you go past all that content, you'll feel the pure I amness of this very moment. That thing is God. It also feels like infinite love. I remember moments where I became fully conscious of the infinite love of God. You don't even know what love is until you've experienced infinite love. God also feels divine, radiant, magical, miraculous, and alive. So the reason we call it God and spirituality is because spirit has an inherent divine, radiant, magical quality to it because it's spontaneous being or spontaneous self-creation. It's miraculous. It's literally a miracle. The entire universe, this very moment right here is a miracle. You've just become so jaded to it because you're so preoccupied with just living life pragmatically that you ignore the miracle that is life, the magic that is here, the divinity that's here. You don't see the divinity because you're like a fish in water. And it feels alive in the sense that life is not a limited category that only applies to organic life forms or biological creatures. The entire universe is alive. It's sentient, it's conscient, or it's sentient and it's conscious. So when you realize that radically reinterprets how you related to the universe, because before that you had a materialistic paradigm. Under the materialistic paradigm, you viewed most of the universe, except for creatures, you viewed most of it as dead matter. But after the epiphany of God, you realize that it's not dead at all. It's alive. Everything's alive. Molecules are alive. The earth is alive. It's a much broader, more expanded notion of what life is. God also feels like not knowing. God feels like irreducible mystery. You might think that you're going to know God, but really you're not going to know God. You're going to not know God. Because like I told you, you can't know God, you can be God. But to be God means you can't know it, precisely because knowing is a second order emergent or phenomenon of being. Knowing is always indirect. Knowing is what separates you from God. Not knowing is as close to God as you can get. And see, this is the whole problem with the scientific paradigm, is that science is always trying to explain and reduce away the mystery of existence. And the way it does that is by substituting some other object. So it's taking content within existence and explaining it by pointing to some other content. So, how did the Earth get here? Well, because of some space dust from some star. But how did the space dust get there? Well, because of some other star that exploded. And how did that get there? Well, some other star exploded. But how did it ultimately get here? Well, because there was a Big Bang. But how did that get here? Well, we don't know. See? So science is playing this game of explaining one thing in terms of another thing until ultimately you take it to the Big Bang and then you just say, oh, well, forget about it. We can't really know. And then let's just go about living an ordinary life. See, this is the whole game. The whole point of this tail-chasing exercise that it never ends. It's infinite. But you're not realizing that it's infinite. And therefore, you're not realizing that that science ultimately doesn't explain a goddamn thing. See? All you're doing is you're explaining one corner of creation in terms of another corner. That's what science is doing. It's drawing connections, but it's not seeing the totality all at once, which is what differentiates science from spirituality. God also feels like the greatest moment of your life. For sure. The greatest moment of your life. Nothing else comes close. And it feels totally life-transforming. It feels like after this epiphany, nothing in your life will ever be the same again. All right, now let's talk about why God is so confusing. This is an important point to address because otherwise people don't take this topic seriously enough. They underestimate just how self-deceptive this topic is. So let's go through the list. Firstly, like we said, because God is a level of consciousness, and most people don't appreciate that there are different levels of consciousness, and they never access the higher, rarefied levels of consciousness, and therefore they try to understand something which is beyond them. It's like they're blind people trying to understand what color looks like. The solution there is to actually look at colors. Cure your blindness rather than trying to intellectually understand what colors are while you're still blind. Another reason is because God is formless. God can't be pointed to. And that's a very confusing notion for people because people are used to form. Form is everything you've ever experienced about reality. So how do you get the mind to become aware of the formless when the mind can only deal with the formed? That's very challenging. How do you get scientists to admit of the formless when all they do is study form? How do you run a lab experiment on the formless? See, this is why people deny God is because they don't know how to turn it into a form. And it's precisely because God is all form that you can't see it. See? If God was one particular form, it would be easy to point to and say, there it is. But not when God is formless and therefore all form. God is also confusing because it's beyond the mind. There's just an inherent assumption that's made by people that if something exists and is true, and if it's important and significant, then hey, my mind can just think about it, understand it, believe in it, and there we go, problem solved. But that doesn't work with God. Because God is a different type of question, different type of issue. The types of issues that we're used to using our mind for are actually inside of the universe. We never ask our mind to go outside and beyond the universe. But we have to when we're asking the question of, where did the entire universe come from? That's a different type of question. See, the difference between existential questions and scientific questions are that scientific questions are about the content of one's state of consciousness, whereas existential questions are about consciousness itself, beyond the content, the context. Science can't grapple with context. So, for example, inside of a matrix, like in the movie, there are people doing science. Supposedly, in that movie, The Matrix, and how many scientists are in that movie? I mean, in the fiction of that universe. Well, there's millions, billions of them, right? But all the science they're doing, I mean, it's good science relative to the context of the matrix that they're in. But if you exit and leave the context of the matrix, then what does their science amount to? Nothing. It's just a fiction. In the same way that you can imagine that you're a scientist inside one of your dreams when you're sleeping, but then you wake up and you realize that all that was nonsense. So the problem that science has is it can't see that the science is being done inside of a dream. And so it attempts to use science to understand dreams without realizing that science is part of the dream. So that's never going to work. Another reason why God is so confusing is because it's so big, staggering, and incredible that it's hard to take it seriously. It sounds too good to be true. Its consequences are epic. Another reason is because God is a total mindfuck, and most people don't like to get mindfucked. Personally, I have a hard time relating to this because I love getting mindfucked, and that's probably why I'm sitting here today talking about this stuff. But for most people, ordinary people, you know, your grandma, she doesn't want to get mindfucked. She wants her life to be simple, clear-cut, black and white, just mundane stuff, simple little truths. Because it's scary. Getting mindfucks is scary. It's uncomfortable. Also, God is confusing because it's a deep paradox, and it's a strange loop. And people find it very difficult to deal with strange loops. Western intellectual tradition has spent a lot of time demonizing paradox and being threatened by paradox, because paradox threatens the conceptual castles that we build within philosophy or even within science. Paradox threatens that. Paradox and strange loops threaten the illusion of simple cause and effect, linear explanations of how existence works. God is also confusing because it requires radical open-mindedness, and most people are closed-minded. They're not willing to open their mind to radical ideas. For example, are you willing to open your mind to the possibility that death can't happen? Are you willing to open your mind to the possibility that if you shoot yourself in the head, that it won't be a bad thing, but it'll be a good thing? See, most people don't want to go there. Are you willing to open yourself up to the possibility that your parents and your friends are just creations of your imagination and that they don't really exist. See, that's too much for most people. God is confusing because people aren't willing to do existential investigation and because they already assume that they know. For religious people, their biggest obstacle to God is their ideas about God. They think they know everything about God, so when I tell them what God is, they think they know better. Leo, who are you to tell me what God is? Let me tell you what God is. But have you done the existential investigation? How many thousands of hours have you spent doing the work? Or for those atheists, they do the opposite. They have a mirror problem where they try to convince me, Leo, let me tell you how God doesn't exist. But have you done the work? Do you even know the foundations of science and knowledge? Do you even know how that works? Do you know how proof works? Have you investigated these things? Have you investigated the scientific method? Have you questioned it? Have you questioned materialism? Have you questioned whether an external physical objective reality exists? Probably not, because if you did, you would be agreeing with me here. You wouldn't be challenging me. Because people are egotistical and arrogant. God is confusing. Because God conflicts with ego, with control, and with survival. See, most people are preoccupied with their own survival. They're not interested in lofty existential questions. They just want to know how to earn money and have sex and create a cushy little life for themselves. And God goes against all of that. God requires surrendering your ego, surrendering control, taking energy and time away from chasing money and chasing sex and chasing material luxuries and chasing power. It's the opposite of survival. Survival makes you callous about truth because truth can inhibit your survival. God is confusing because it requires facing your own death. And who wants to face his or her own death? Do you? Not just as an idea, but actually facing it and seeing what lays on the other side. God is confusing because being cannot be symbolized, like I said earlier. God cannot be depicted, spoken, or written. Cannot be put into words or communicated. What I'm doing here, it might seem like I'm communicating God. No, I'm not. I'm giving you various pointers, but I'm not really showing you God with my words. Nor can you draw a diagram of God, or a schematic, or a picture, nor can you put it into some equations. And what scientists and intellectuals don't understand is that you're never going to be able to put God into equations because all equations are necessarily finite and limited, whereas God is infinite. You can't put infinity into an equation because your equation is itself part of infinity. You can't put the larger into the smaller the way you're trying to do. This needs to be recognized. But most people doing scientific work don't understand this. They fail to distinguish between symbols and being. God is confusing because very few people have the direct experiences that I'm talking about. And because it requires thousands of hours of meditation or contemplation or various forms of inquiry and investigation to have these direct experiences. They don't come easily. And most people are not willing to put in this amount of time because they can't foresee how it's going to be worth it. And also because they don't take it seriously enough to actually do the research that needs to be done. You need to already be radically open-minded to see the possibility that this might lead you somewhere, to then go and follow up on that for thousands of hours and do very difficult, emotionally laborious work to ultimately break through to some epiphany. God is confusing because our culture, society, and media is very materialistic. And really, it's still stuck in the Dark Ages. People take for granted how much more evolution we have to do culturally, societally. We just tend to assume we have technology and gadgets and internet and smartphones, that because of this, we're an advanced species. And because of this, we understand how the universe works. This is an illusion. We are barbarians and apes still very much, still stuck in the dark ages. But that won't be recognized for hundreds of years yet to come. So if you were born 1,000 years in the future, then all of this would be very easy. You'd be taught all this stuff in preschool or in first grade, and you would just pursue it. You'd do the practices. You'd be taught how to meditate. This would all be just standard practice. You wouldn't even question it. And you'd probably be fully conscious of God by the time you're 10 years old, if our education system was structured properly. But it isn't, because of our culture, our society, and our media, our politics. And God is confusing because metaphysics and epistemology aren't taken seriously. They aren't taught in school. Elementary school through high school, you're not taught about metaphysics or epistemology at all. And in university, you're only taught about it if you take specific philosophy courses, which a few people take, most people don't take. And even when they take them, they don't take them seriously. It's just like a fun class you take, which bears no practical impact on your life. Even scientists, I'm shocked at how poor of a grasp of metaphysics and epistemology most scientists have, including astrophysicists and quantum physicists. It's pathetic. This is a deep cultural problem, a problem with our education system. If we structured our education system properly, metaphysics and epistemology would be the foundation of all education. But see, it seems too impractical. It seems too abstract. But again, hey, I mean, you took 12 years of math, and that was complex and abstract, and you don't even use math in your everyday life. Almost, unless you have some very technical field, you basically never use math beyond just basic arithmetic. God is confusing because success of science creates a false illusion of existential understanding. We have been lulled into a false sense of complacency due to the last 100 years of the success of science and technology. And we think that just because we can build a rocket ship or a supercomputer or the internet, that because of this, that now we have existential understanding. No, we just figured out how to create technology. These are two very different things. And we need to make sure that we don't get seduced by our technological advancements. We are much more technologically advanced than we are cognitively developed or consciously developed or socially developed or politically developed. And this is creating a lot of problems. A lot of existential problems are actually now being caused by these technological imbalances. God is also confusing because the foundations of science are misunderstood. And I've already touched on that before. God is confusing because it doesn't seem possible. It doesn't seem possible that there could be a God or should be a God. It doesn't seem practical. Leo, what am I going to get out of this? Your ego asks. But that's exactly the problem, is looking at reality in such a way that you're only looking at it from your little personal egoic point of view. If you look at it that way, you're never going to be able to access God. God doesn't care about you in the sense that you think, in the sense that you care about yourself, in preserving your petty little existence. God has way bigger plans for the universe that are unfolding. And hey, you know what? Maybe they won't involve you. God is also confusing because reality is subjective and relative. And the mind has a difficult time dealing with relativity. Pre-rational people don't understand relativity, and even many rationalists don't really understand relativity. You have to be at spiral dynamic stage green to start to understand relativity, and even then, the full scope of it hasn't hit you yet. You haven't realized yet that the very substance of existence is relative. atoms and molecules are relative to your own mind. You constructed them. They don't exist for other creatures but for you. And the subjective nature of reality is denied by science and by most people. We're trying to access objective reality without realizing that objective reality is just a concept within your subjective conscious experience. There is nothing objective about the universe. It's pure subjectivity, pure relativity. God is confusing because the mind is self-deceptive. Go check out my 3-part mini-series on self-deception, which covers all of that. God is confusing because skepticism is misused. Go check out my episode called True versus False Skepticism, where I talk about how skepticism can be misused. Many skeptics these days, skepticism is popular, especially amongst atheists, but they misuse it because what they make a mockery of skepticism, because they will say, well, Leo, prove it to me. Otherwise, if you don't prove it to me, then it doesn't exist. It can't possibly be real. It's the sort of attitude that the truth must be delivered to you with overwhelming proof and evidence, and only then will you accept it. This totally takes responsibility away from you from actually doing the hard work of discovering the truth. I'm not trying to prove anything to you here in this episode. I'm presenting you with possibilities of things that you can verify for yourself. So you need to get off your lazy ass and verify the things that I'm talking about. That is true skepticism. A true skeptic puts his own skepticism to the test and also questions his own assumptions. Skepticism itself must be questioned. How do you know that skepticism is the right way to get to the truth? Could it be that skepticism itself is just a self-deception? Could it be that your own crippling skepticism is keeping you from actually doing the work that is necessary in order to experience higher states of consciousness, which are beyond skepticism? God is confusing because it reveals everything to be an illusion. And who wants that? Do you want everything to be revealed as an illusion? Society, culture, government, language, religion, science, rationality, logic, your own humanity, your own personal biography, your own birth, your parents, your friends, everything will be revealed to be an illusion. Can you deal with that? Most people can't. Most people are in denial about this possibility. God is also confusing because it threatens power hierarchies. Our entire economic, governmental, political, and social system, religion, business, is all built upon power hierarchies that try to maintain status quo. This is what the ego does. This is how survival happens. And it's all built on illusions, false justifications, trying to ground its power in some sort of fixed position within reality, which of course doesn't exist. So mankind, especially those at the top of the power hierarchies, try to justify their power through some sort of appeal to God or to truth or to justice or fairness or goodness or whatever. And whenever they're doing that, they're always lying. That's always the ego at work. Because in truth, there's no reason that there should be this power hierarchy. Many of these power hierarchies are false. But of course, the ego doesn't want to give up its power. The tyrant is not going to step off the throne willingly. Got to be forced out. So of course, the tyrant is always playing games of illusions, trickery, deception, and isn't interested in the truth. And also, God is confusing because once you know God, no one will understand you, and you will not be able to communicate it to anyone other than those people who have already also experienced God, in which case it's pointless to communicate with them because they already know. So it's a catch-22. How are you going to convince people in the Matrix that they're in the Matrix when they're in the Matrix? They won't know until they break out of the Matrix. Appreciate that. Appreciate all of these challenges. Appreciate how tricky this is. It's really a work of art. The trickery of God is a work of art. Now let's move on to the next section, which is I want to share with you the various names of God, various words that point to the same thing. It can be a big insight to realize that all religions are fundamentally talking about the same thing. So here's a list that I've compiled that I really like. God, enlightenment, awakening, oneness, the one, the all, Godhead, nothingness, truth, non-duality, the absolute, ego death, infinity, absolute infinity, self-transcendence, self-realization, consciousness, awareness, presence, now with a capital N, being with a capital B, existence, reality, isness, suchness, liberation, moksha, no self, true self with a capital S, the self with a capital S, universe with a capital S, universal mind, mind with a capital M, spirit with a capital S, the Great Spirit, or Wakan Tanaka, as the Native Americans know it. Revelation, illumination, theosis, kenosis, ecstasy, rebirth, cessation, Holy Spirit, gnosis, agape, Atman, Brahman, the void, emptiness, nirvana, yoga, union, Buddha mind, no mind, Kensho, Satori, stream entry, fruition, the groundless ground, the gateless gate, the ox from Zen, prajna, jnana, shunyata, turiya, rigpa, bodhi, mu, Shiva, Krishna, samadhi, Ein Sof, Satchitananda, Allah, Tawheed, Fana Alfana, the greater jihad, Yahweh, Yehovah, Om, I am, Tat Tvam Asi, Hashem, Deus, Zeus, Teotl, Lord, Supreme Being, Creator, the all-seeing eye. And as big as that list is, there's a lot more that I could add to it. If you really want to go on a mission to find all the names of God, that'll take you a long time, sorting through lots of history books and religious texts. Now, those of you who are a little bit more advanced, you might want to split hairs here with me and nitpick. And you might say, well, Leo, what are you talking about? Samadhi is not the same thing as Kensho, is not the same thing as Turiya, is not the same thing as Nirvana, is not the same thing as the Holy Spirit. Look, yes, we can make very fine-grained distinctions, and when you become advanced, you will do that. All of these words are fundamentally pointing to the same thing. But of course, like we said before, there's many facets and aspects to God. So some of these words point to one particular facet versus another. Other words point to the whole thing, and so forth. So just, you want to make sure that you don't let your pedantry and your splitting of hairs to interfere with your broader understanding of what we're really talking about. And for newbies, this list is a great starting point. You can research these names, go Google them, find them on Wikipedia, read about them, draw the interconnections that you need to, use them to do the research to verify the things that I say. So now, how do you experience God? What are the techniques? Well, there are a variety of different ways. One is metaphysical questioning, questioning the very fabric of reality and existence and what knowledge is in a lot of depth. Another one is deconstruction, deconstructing your entire life and belief system, questioning everything to death until nothing remains, and what that is God. Another is self-inquiry, which I've talked a lot about. You can find my latest episode on how to do self-inquiry. If you search for how to do self-inquiry, you'll see that. You can also go to the forum, and I have a practical guide for how to do self-inquiry pinned at the very top of the meditation and enlightenment subforum. Another technique is meditation, of course, and there's many different kinds of meditation that you can use. Many of them are effective. But in general, it's going to take more than just regular meditation. It's going to take meditation plus deconstruction of some kind. A lot of people will do meditation for years, but they will never actually experience God because they're doing meditation as sort of not at an industrial grade level. Just meditating for 20 or 30 or even 60 minutes a day is really not going to be sufficient. You need something more than that. Another way is through concentration and visualization. There are many visualization yogic techniques and concentration techniques. In fact, see my episode called Concentration versus Meditation, where I compare and contrast those two. Concentration is a little bit more difficult and a little bit more powerful. And really, if you want to become conscious of God, the most direct way is to build crazy high levels of focus and concentration, which you do through concentration practices. Another way is through yoga. There are many different kinds of yogic systems. One that I highly recommend is Kriya Yoga, but it's a little bit involved and detailed and technical, and it will probably take training with a master in order to really learn it. Or if you go to my forum, into the spirituality subcategory, the sub forum, there you will find a mega thread about how to learn Kriya Yoga. I highly recommend Kriya Yoga as an avenue towards God. It can be very powerful. It can be more powerful than meditation, concentration, or self-inquiry, especially if you have a lot of monkey mind, the way that I used to do. Another way is psychedelics. I highly recommend psychedelics. Of course, 5-MeO-DMT is the best psychedelic for meeting God, but also mushrooms, LSD, NN-DMT, and others can be just as effective in certain cases. All depends on how you use them. Psychedelics are a remarkable tool in this regard because with all these other techniques, usually you're talking about thousands of hours of practice before you start to experience God. And for many skeptical people, well, that's a tall order to fill. They're not going to do it. They're not going to be motivated enough. But psychedelics, they're so wonderful precisely because they can open the gateway to God just within 30 minutes, within 60 minutes, within a few hours. And while it won't last, you won't be able to stabilize in that consciousness, you will have your first glimpses, and that will be sufficient to then get you to start to do the serious practices. Another way to experience God is through deep suffering and deprivation. And this is a time-modern technique. People have been using fasting and isolating themselves out in the desert without water and food for weeks. People have been doing this for thousands of years. This is a time-honored way to reach God very quickly. The problem is that it involves a lot of suffering. Why do you want to incur that much suffering? I mean, most people will just not be able to do it. Meditation, concentration in and of itself has got plenty of suffering in it already. To just put yourself through a deliberate process of deep suffering and deprivation probably is beyond most people, although it can work as well. Another technique is meditation retreats and solo retreats. So even though meditation, you might say meditation retreats, meditation, what's the difference? Well, even though I already talked about meditation, the retreat is really where seeing God happens. So if you've been meditating for years and you haven't experienced God, you might be wondering, like, Leo, how do I do it? Well, it's because you haven't been meditating for long enough. Really what you need is you need a retreat where you meditate for 10 or 30 days straight, 24/7. Even as you're going to sleep, you're basically in a meditative zone. And so you're meditating for literally hundreds of hours straight back to back. And that increases your chances of discovering God by 1,000-fold. So I highly recommend that. And also there's dark room retreats, where if you lock yourself in a dark room, pitch black room with no sunlight whatsoever for an entire week, that will help to stimulate various neurotransmitters in the brain to then help you to attain those rarefied high states of consciousness. It's sort of like a natural psychedelic. So those are the ways. There's probably, not probably, but I know there's many other ways, but I'm just talking about the most direct that I have some experience with. What are the ways not to experience God? So this is also important so that you don't go fooling yourself thinking that the practice that you're using will actually get you there. So you're not going to experience God through the mind, through beliefs, through thinking, concept, ideas, opinions, imagination, knowledge, or language. Throw all that out the window. God is beyond all that. Prior to all that. You're not going to experience God through rational inquiry or figuring God out or figuring existence out. You're never going to be able to figure it out. Or through traditional Western philosophy. You're also not going to do it through scientific modeling, theorizing, or equations. If you think you're going to find God through mathematics, you're wrong. You won't. Because mathematics are always finite and God is infinite. You won't experience God through proof or double-blind clinical studies. It doesn't work that way. You need a direct experience, which means that you're intimately involved. It's going to have to be subjective. Don't go looking for an objective experience of God. Your experience of God will be subjective. And in that moment, objectivity, the notion of objective experience, will be expunged out of your mind. You're not going to experience God through cynical skepticism, debate or discussion, academic study, studying scriptures or sacred texts. Now, about this point, I need to make a little caveat. It actually is possible to have epiphanies and mystical insights by studying scriptures and sacred texts, but only as an adjunct to your other work. Sometimes you read a powerful scripture or spiritual text, and the author, if the author is speaking from truth and from non-duality, can say something that will trigger something in you to have some kind of aha, some epiphany. And those can be very powerful and legitimate. And I recommend that you do study some scriptures and some spiritual texts as you're doing this work, but definitely don't make it your sole technique, because that's not going to fly, because it's too much language, too much concept. You're not going to find God by going to church or through traditional prayer for the most part. Now, certain prayer, again, another caveat, certain prayer is quite meditative. And so at that point, prayer basically turns into meditation or concentration. And in that case, that can be legitimate and you can actually experience God that way. But this is not traditional prayer where you pray for God to help you with your egotistical goals and plans. That's not the kind of prayer we're talking about here. We're talking about real meditative prayer. You're not going to find God, generally speaking, through ritual or ceremony, although certain ceremonies can be quite powerful. And you're certainly not going to find God through books, audios, videos, lectures, and podcasts, although all of those can be very helpful as supplemental material on your journey. They're not enough to actually get you the consciousness states that you need. And certainly not through online commentary and online forums, where you're going to waste a lot of your time debating and discussing God, but not actually doing the work. So watch out for all those. All of these can easily become distractions and traps from doing the other stuff that I said that really does work. So the reason people do this stuff that doesn't work is precisely because the ego mind doesn't want to do the stuff that works. Precisely because it's afraid of death and it's too threatening to do techniques that are actually very powerful. So a lot of times people will waste decades doing weak, piddly techniques. And that's really by the design of the ego. You need to open your mind to the possibility of samadhi. Samadhi means direct consciousness or being. This is how you're going to access God, through samadhi, not through knowledge, not through belief, not through concepts, not through language, not through the mind, not through thoughts, not through theory, not rationality. Samadhi is not knowledge. Samadhi is not even ordinary experience, because ordinary experience presupposes a subject-object duality between the experiencer and the experienced thing. Samadhi is a collapsing of those. It's a non-dual form of perception or knowledge, you might say. Knowledge, traditional knowledge, also doesn't work because traditional knowledge also assumes a separation between the knower and the thing that is being known. Samadhi collapses those two together. Samadhi is not even perception, because perception, as you understand it conventionally, is actually also presuming a subject-object duality between the perceiver and the thing being perceived. That needs to be collapsed as well. The problem also with perception is that perception is grounded in a certain metaphysics that you have, the materialist metaphysics. So you're thinking of perception as a process of you, a biological entity with a brain and neurons, looking at an object, light bouncing off of stuff, going in your eye, going in your brain, and this produces perception. This is not going to work because that is indirect. So you need to go beyond perception. And this is the problem, is that most people don't realize that there's something beyond experience, beyond perception, beyond knowledge. Samadhi is also not hallucination. Samadhi is not fantasy. And samadhi is not scientific experiment or data. It's something new. Most people, 99% of people, have never experienced samadhi, and they don't even know that it's a possibility. So if you want to experience God, you need to open yourself up to the possibility of samadhi. And more than that, you need to go and actually experience samadhi for yourself. It's a hell of a thing. Good stuff. Blow your socks off. That's what we call a mystical experience, is a samadhi of some kind. Now, I recommend, if you're new to this and you just want to get a quick test to verify the things that I'm talking about, and you want to get a fast glimpse of God so you don't waste thousands of your hours doing various kinds of arcane practices, I recommend Psychedelics plus a little bit of existential inquiry. Start to get a journal and deconstruct your own beliefs, your own ideas, and then find some good psychedelics. And that will be your doorway into spirituality. But then you're going to have to go beyond that, because psychedelics can prove to be a trap if they are your only technique. But why I love psychedelics so much is it's the only tool that lets you access these very advanced truths very quickly without having to spend years studying and reading books and doing all this sorts of stuff that most people simply won't do. In this regard, psychedelics are amazing. Psychedelics, in a sense, are the most scientific way of accessing God, because, hell, we can take a person and administer 30 milligrams of 5-MeO-DMT, and a vast majority of these people are going to have direct experiences of God. This has been proven through scientific clinical studies that have already been done. Go do the research. There's an enormous amount of scientific research, if you're looking for it, about the mystical experiences possible under psychedelics. Now, of course, none of this will really mean anything to you unless you go through the experience yourself. It doesn't matter what psychedelic experiences I've had or others have had. You have to get into it yourself. You have to get intimately involved. That's the only way you're going to discover God. So that's the end. In conclusion, what I'll tell you is that if you truly understood the things that I said here, then you will do two things. Number one, you will immediately begin to do research into the things that I've said, Googling around, going to Wikipedia, reading books, and so forth, to validate the things that I've said. Because I don't want you to just rely on me and take this as a new dogma of yours. That's not going to fly. It's not going to help you. You need to really become convinced that this is a possibility for you and that it's worthwhile to do. And then secondly, of course, if you really understood what I said, is that you're going to have to dedicate some serious time and energy into these practices to actually get you there. How seriously you do your practices is a direct reflection of how well you understood the significance of the things that I said. What I said here was extremely significant, if true. Now, from your point of view, I could be deluded, I could be lying, I could be hallucinating, I could be a religious fanatic, I could be a cult leader or whatever. And that's right. From your point of view, you don't know. That's why you got to do the research and start doing the practices. And then come back to me and we'll talk about it. Stay tuned for part 2 of this mini-series, where we will address a lot of FAQs and more objections. Also, check out my other episodes. Check out my 2-part mini-series called Understanding Absolute Infinity if you want an even deeper explanation into the actual existential mechanics of the Godhead, how it really works with great analogies and examples. I really like that mini-series, one of my favorite. I put a lot of my heart into it. And also check out my episode called What is Spirituality? That's also a really good introduction. Also check out What is Perception and What is Consciousness. So that's it. I'm done here. Please remember to click that like button for me and come check out Actualized.org right there. At the website, you will find my blog, you will find the forum, you will find the book list, you'll find the life purpose course. The book list is going to be very valuable for you on this journey. So when I talk about doing research, what you have to understand about Actualized.org that it's grounded in an enormous amount of research that I do. Over the last 10 years, I've read hundreds of books, hundreds of audiobooks, courses, retreats, like so much research from lots of different perspectives, because nobody takes the possibility of self-deception and delusion and fantasy more seriously than I do. I'm always concerned about, am I deceiving myself? Am I really understanding these spiritual ideas properly? That's why I literally cross-reference hundreds of sources from the best yogis and spiritual masters and teachers from all the different religions and all the different traditions. From Buddhism to Hinduism to yoga, to Tantra, to Judaism, to Islam. Like, I'm voracious in cross-referencing all this stuff because I know how dangerous it is and how tricky it is, how easy it is for me to fool myself. That's what Actualized.org is grounded in. And you need to drink a bit from that cup as well, which means you can't just be following me and just be believing me and assuming that everything I do is correct. You need to do some amount of reading. Now, you don't probably need to read as much as I've read. You don't need to cross-reference as much as I've cross-referenced. It's a full-time job, honestly. I mean, I spend sometimes weeks and days just sitting around on the couch, contemplating stuff I've read in books, validating against my own experience, trying to make sense of this stuff. That's my work. So you probably don't need to go that hardcore into it. But you need some degree of that. Otherwise, you're going to delude yourself and to fall into various kinds of traps. It's not just enough to know the things that I talk about. You also have to learn about the various other traps that exist in this work. And there's so many different ways that you can trick yourself, that you can get caught up in some kind of pathology, some kind of half-baked mystical experience or vision that you have, which isn't really complete. Your ego misinterprets it, right? Your mind can misinterpret these experiences very easily. So don't think that just because you've had one mystical experience that this now makes you infallible and that now you understand everything. Just the opposite. It's very easy to become a Zen devil unless you are you're really careful. And a lot of the material that I release is designed to make you a very careful student of these topics so that you're not sloppy, you're not a black and white thinker, so you don't get caught up in some cult or some ideology or some pet theory of yours, and you go off the deep end somewhere and get yourself into trouble and get other people into trouble. So start doing the research. If you understand the significance of what is being communicated here, you're going to start doing the research and start doing the practices, and I'll see you in the future.